Alright, in today's video I'm going to talk about manipulating Microsoft Forms responses in Power Automate. And when I say manipulating, I'm not talking about necessarily changing the content of, but repurposing or basically taking part of a choice question response in order to fill a field in a SharePoint list. So we'll get into more details momentarily. But just to kind of set up the scenario or state the problem, when you're building a Microsoft form, you might have a choice question. Maybe it's a form that people are going to use to request help. And they might not be sure. You want to ask them which department should this request be routed to, and they might not understand what each department does. So you'll want to provide some additional context in that form to tell them that this department does this department does that. But how do you do that in kind of a convenient, concise way? So if we take a look at our, the setup here, here's just a quick example of what this form might look like. If you were to, the first option is to have the description of those choices separate from the actual choices, so that when you're feeding this data into your SharePoint list using Power Automate, you can simply say enter the value selected for a department in that field. And this certainly works. Now in this example I only have 4 choices, and on a browser screen it looks okay, but if we were to look at the mobile view and consider that people very likely could be using a mobile device to fill this in, it gets kind of cumbersome because they're going to have to scroll back and forth. And this is just one question. If you have multiple questions like this, there could be a lot of scrolling involved. Or even just one question with more than 4 items. So 4, they can kind of get the descriptions and the choices all in here at one time. But a better way to do it, or better way to kind of look at it, is to basically combine those descriptions into the choices themselves. Now the problem is that if you want to feed that data into, feed human resources into a column in your SharePoint list without all of this text after it, you need to do a little manipulation of that text. So in other words, you need to get the response to the question and then use some expressions to break it apart and bring back just the pieces that you need. And just to kind of again show what this looks like, that it does look a bit cleaner. They see the names and the descriptions right there. They can select what they want. Now in the grand scheme of things, because you can have single select questions, you can have multiple select questions, and you might be using these to feed into choice columns in SharePoint or lookup columns in SharePoint. Lookup columns are a really convenient, make a lot of things in SharePoint possible, but they are also a bit more complicated to work with. So in this particular video, what we're going to focus on are single and multi-select choice columns in SharePoint, matching with single and multi-select choice questions on a form, because those are relatively easy, pretty straightforward. Single select lookup columns are a little bit of a challenge, but they're doable. They're not overly complicated, because basically you just have to understand that lookup columns in SharePoint are populated or store an object as opposed to a value, and it's predicated on the ID number of the item that it's looking up to, or that's selected in that lookup column. But a single select is pretty straightforward because you're just getting one value. Multi-select lookups are, I'll be honest, they're messy. I'm going to actually break out in part 2 of this video will be just that multi-select lookup column scenario. So we're going to kind of tackle the first 3 in this video. Hopefully this will make sense as we start going through some examples. All right, so the 3 expressions we're going to use, first one is split, and split basically takes a value or a string and splits it based on a separator. So in our example in the slide here, we have apple, orange, lemon. If we were to split that on the comma character, then it's going to output an array or list of apple, orange, lemon. Pretty basic. The next expression we're going to need to understand and use is the first expression. And what that does is it returns the first item in a collection or an array. So again, if we kind of point it at the, use the first expression on the output of that split expression, where we've got apple, orange, lemon, it's going to return apple because apple is the first item in that collection. There is a corresponding last expression. If for whatever reason you need to get the last item from that collection, you can do that as well. So yeah, first and last are kind of utility expressions that I use quite a bit. And then we're also going to need to use a JSON expression when it comes to the multi-selects. And this is because in a Microsoft form, when you have a multi-select question or a question that allows a choice question with multiple selections enabled, the data is going to come into Power Automate in an array format, but it's not really a clean JSON formatted array. So the JSON expression basically takes that, cleans it up, turns it into a proper JSON that Power Automate can work with. And then lastly, we're going to use a select expression or select action in Power Automate, which select is used to kind of shape data. So when you have data that you need to put into a particular format, it's usually for kind of reformatting arrays or objects, but select is a good way to do that. And that, again, I don't have a slide for select, but we will talk about it as we get into that example. Now with choice columns in SharePoint, single selects are just a choice value or text value. Multi-selects are an array of text values. So that's where we need to use that select action to shape the data into the proper format. So let's just jump in and take a look at those choice columns first. Let me go over to my flow here. So yes, this is basically our initial setup. And I'm just going to kind of walk through the basics of what we're going to do, and then I'm going to jump over to a completed flow to show you the details of how it works or how all this stuff fits together. All right, so first off, we've got and I put all these scopes in here just as a means of organizing. You don't have to use scopes, but if you want to maintain your sanity a little bit and make it easier to navigate your flows, you will use scopes. It's just a good way to categorize. There are certain things you can't put into a scope. Like if you're going to use initialize a variable, you can't do that inside of a scope, but pretty much everything else can be put into a scope just to keep things a little more readable. Anyway, that's my stance on scopes. All right, so we've got first here just a compose action where we're bringing in the response data of that department single select choice column or choice question. Now if I want to split that and basically just get the first part of it, this is the expression I'm going to use. I'm just going to rebuild it now just so you can see how it's done. And a lot of times people will do this piecemeal where they'll have a bunch of compose actions with each piece of the expression, but you can nest expressions. You just need to nest them in the proper order. So I'm going to go over to the expression tab here. Now the first thing I want to do is I want to split that value. So split department based on that colon, because when I go back over here, you can see that we've got the title of our department and then a colon and then the description. So that's what I want to split on. So I'm going to type in split, open parenthesis, and then go to my dynamic content. And I could select this compose department, but that would require me to keep that step in. If I want to clean things up and delete that later, I will actually just go and select the actual department question response. So there we go. And now the important thing is at the end here, you need to put a comma and then put your separator in single quotes. So our separator is going to be the colon character. So basically at the end of the day, your expression should be split that. Now that's going to split it and create an array where the first item in the array is the name that I want to feed in, and the second item is the description of it. So what I need to do is actually take that and wrap it in the first expression. So first and then go to the end, put another parenthesis. So what we end up with is, and again, you need to nest them in the proper format. If you swap first and split around, this isn't going to work. So basically you're working from the inside out. So in the inside, we're splitting the response details on the colon character, and then the first expression is going to return the first item from that array that's created. So that's really all there is to it for a single select choice question. Now if we go down to the multi-select, this is where it gets a little more complicated, just a little bit, because this is going to come in as an array, but it's not that clean JSON format array. So the first thing I need to do, actually I'm going to show you how to skip a step, because I was going to show you how to use add a compose to convert it to JSON and then use a select, but we're going to jump right to select because we can just plug that JSON expression into the input. So let me go to select, and we need to use select here because we need to put the data into the proper format. In other words, when we want to fill that multi-select choice question using Power Automate, or choice column using Power Automate, it needs to have it in a format where it is the value and then the actual word value and then the value to put in there. So I'm going to use a select expression that is going to allow us to do that. Now for the input of this, this is where I'm going to use that JSON expression so JSON, and then again I'm going to go back to our actual response details and select departments, and that's it. So that's just going to clean up that response, that JSON, that array, put it in proper format, and then within this map, this is where you can build out your array, and what we need the array to have the word value as the title or the key. It's an array of objects, and objects have a key and a value. So the key here is going to be the word value. I know that's confusing, but then within this is where we're going to use that same first split format. So basically this is saying for each item in this now clean JSON array, give me the value which is the I'll just do first split and then departments, and I need to tell it what to split on. So again, colon in single quotes. There we go. So that's that. So let me just save this and let's just run the flow just so we can see what happens here. So if I go to my choices with integrated descriptions, I'm just going to select department, and we'll select 3 of the departments under question 2, and I won't worry about the rest. We'll click submit, and let's see what actually happens in our flow here. So it ran, it succeeded. So in here we can see our department. Basically it's getting, this is the whole string, so it's the name of the department plus that description, but then the value is just going to be human resources, which is what we want to feed into our SharePoint list. For the multi-select, again, it's an array. If I click raw inputs here, we'll see that it's this ugly array of all of those different things. But in our select action, we can see that it's basically bringing in all of those, and then is returning simply value humors. Okay, I screwed something up here. Let me just go to my completed flow to see what I screwed up there. I know what I did. So let me edit this. I went a little crazy because I went a little overboard on that select formula. So basically in here I just need to we're again going to use expression first split. Now, when you're inside of this select action, it's an action that's occurring on an array. And every time you have an action that occurs or works with an array, there is an item property, which means the current item or the element in the array. So I can leverage that to simply say item and then comma single quotes. And there we go. So that should match what I've got there. First split item. Yep. Okay. All right, so let's save this and let's just run this again just so I can confirm that that is what I screwed up. Hey, we all make mistakes, so let's learn from them. All right, so now if I look at my department, multi-select, that's the output that I'm looking for. Simply value, human resources, value, accounting, value, marketing. That's going to be what I need to basically feed into my SharePoint list. Now, before we actually add the SharePoint action, let's go one more step to take the vertical, which is a single select lookup. Now, this is where it gets a little messier. So let me just jump back to the slides so we can talk about the lookup columns. Now, as I said, lookup columns in SharePoint make things possible, but they are more complicated because essentially it's SharePoint. It's using another list or library in your SharePoint site as the source for lookup values or for choice values in that column. Now, this creates what are called linked lists or related lists in SharePoint, which is kind of cool. It's basically leveraging SharePoint as a database, even though SharePoint is not really a database. But the complication comes because when you select that item, it's not just storing the value that you selected, it's storing the ID number of that value or the ID number of the item that was selected. And this is because if you were to change that title, the ID is immutable. It's never going to change for the item that you selected, but you could change the title. So let's say I changed in this example, Apple, if I changed it to a capital A, basically because it's referenced in the SharePoint list by the ID number of the item that's being looked up, it's going to update automatically. So it is kind of cool, but it makes things a little more difficult. Now, and as well as in Power Automate, when we want to set that lookup value or that lookup column in our SharePoint list, we need to use the ID of the selected value. And how are we going to get that? Because the ID is not, it's not as if it's not shown by default, but it's easy to make it visible. But how do you know what it is, and how do we make that work? Well, what we're going to do is use the title, and as long as the list that you're looking up to has the unique requirement set on the title column, then you know you're never going to have two items with the same title. But we can use that title to look up the ID number and then feed that into the appropriate format. All right, so let's jump into our single select answer here. Actually, I'm just going to jump over to the completed flow, and I'm going to copy over the actions to make this happen. Now, within here, basically I've got that vertical answer, vertical value. Let me just select this whole scope. I'm just going to copy that and I'm going to delete the single select scope here. So let me delete this and then add in from my clipboard, there's my vertical single select. That's going to bring in all the actions I need quickly and easily. So just to walk through how this is set up, we've got, again, this is just showing me the answer that's selected. And then I'm using another expression to split that and give me just the value, so just that vertical value. Now in this case, it is a little bit different because I used, if we look at my choices with integrated description, if I go back, we'll see that in here I use that pipe character with a space. So if I were to simply use the pipe character itself as the separator, then the values coming in are going to be the word, so publishing space, and I don't want that space. But here's the cool thing. What I can do in Power Automate is simply that separator doesn't need to be a single character. It can be a string. So I've set the separator to be space, pipe, space. So really just means that space that's before the pipe is where it's going to split. So I can then take the that first chunk without having the space at the end. So pretty easy, not super complicated. Now, in order to get the ID of that item, so again, I need to go to the list. Now in my SharePoint site, here is that separate verticals list where I've got publishing, workforce management, whatever. So these are all of the choices that show up in this vertical or verticals column. So easy enough. But what I need to do is look at this list for the item that matches the value selected in the form, or that first title of the item, and then give back its ID number. So how do I do that? Well, first is I use a get items action, and this is a get items action. I just renamed it to get verticals matching vertical. And it's important that you use the get items, multiple or plural, not the get item, because to get the individual item you need the ID, but what we need here is the ID. So that's not going to work. So what this is going to do, in the advanced options here, we're going to set a filter query. So we know that we're looking up the title from that verticals list. So I want to retrieve things where the title is equal to the output of that composed vertical value. Now again, if I want to kind of clean things up, I can just take this expression, copy that, and I can put the expression into here. That way I'm minimizing the number of expressions or number of actions that I need in my flow, and that's going to get the verticals matching that. Now what this is going to do, whenever you use get items, it's important to remember that it's returning, even if it's returning a single item or 0 items, it's still coming back as an array. It's either an empty array or an array of 1 or an array of all of the items that match that. So it's always going to be coming back as an array. So what we need to do to get the ID is basically use the first expression, because this is going to produce an output of an array of all of the items from that verticals list where the title is matching the title of the item we selected on our form. And what I want to do is get the ID of that. So basically, to do that, I'm going to use, again, the first expression. So in here, we'll go to first, and then dynamic content. And you want to be sure to, so here's our get items action. You must be sure to select the value, not body, but value here. Even though they both say list of items, the value is the one you need. Now, that's going to return that whole item, but what we need is just the ID. So we need to know a little tiny bit about kind of traversing arrays. And whenever you see this question mark, square bracket, it basically means you're digging into that object. I'm sorry, traversing objects, not arrays, but similar idea. So whenever you see that question mark, it means you're digging into that item or retrieving a specific property of that item. So if we look at this whole thing, it's basically giving me the outputs of that action, the body / value, and then at the end I need another question mark. Question mark isn't technically required, but it's a good idea. And then ID and that. So basically square bracket, single quote, ID, which is the column name for the ID number, and then click OK. Hit save. So now that we've got all of that, let's actually throw in our create item in SharePoint action here, so we can see all of this at work. So we'll do create item, select our form sandbox site, and the list name is choices with descriptions. And then momentarily it'll show me, okay, here's what I want for the value. For the title, I'm just going to use the UTC now expression just to put in the current date and time. For the department value, again, I want to select custom value. In this case, I need to find it's going to be the output of an expression. So I'm going to type in output, and what I want is the department value. So that's the one where I use the split and all that. So that's what I want to put in there. For departments value, basically we need to put this in as an array. So if we were to just see what that array looks like, if I select a couple of these, it'll make a little more sense. Now if I open this array, this is the format that it needs it in, and that's why we had to use that select action, because it's going to give it to us in that format. But what I'm going to do here is just basically in this text view or array view, I'm going to again search for outputs, but in this case what I want is the output of that select, which I stupidly didn't name, but I know it's called select, so I'm going to use that. Let me just go back and clean that up and call that select. Yeah, breaking my own rules. Departments values. All right, and it's sometimes this updates, sometimes it doesn't. Worst case scenario, you just can delete that and then basically look up the select departments value. So basically look it up based on the name that you changed it to. And then for the vertical single select ID, we can again enter custom value, and there's our compose vertical ID output. All right, let's hit save, and let's go and fill in our form again. This time we will fill it in with one department, two departments, and then the single select vertical will select education, and we will submit that. And then let's take a look at our flow run. It succeeded, everything worked, and if I jump over to our list here, we can see that there's our human resources, accounting, marketing, and education. So boom, that's part one of this. So again, we're going to deal with the multi-select lookups in another video. I don't know how soon I'll get that out here, but this kind of gives you at least a start, so you understand how to use the first expression, the split expression, to parse out the response data from the form, and get that into the appropriate format. We talked about using compose to kind of troubleshoot along the way, so we can see that's getting the answer, and then to get the value we're splitting it out, and then we have to use that to get the verticals to where the title is equal to education, and then we need to, this is going to produce an array like this. Even though it's an array of one item, it's an array, but there is the ID number that we need to retrieve, and when I look at that, there is the value, and then we're feeding that into the create item. So pretty straightforward. Again, it's going to get more fun and complicated when we talk about multi-select lookups, but hopefully that's enough for you today, and tune in for that other video when it comes out. All right, thanks and have a great day.